You're listening to The Globalist, first broadcast on the 1st of April 2025 on Monocle Radio. The Globalist, in association with UBS. Live from London, this is The Globalist with me, Emma Nelson. A very warm welcome to today's programme. Coming up,
I will guarantee him that if he comes, the ICC's ruling will have no effect in Hungary.
Benjamin Netanyahu readies himself for a trip to Budapest. We look ahead to a visit which demonstrates the closest of ties between Israel and Hungary and the challenges faced by the International Criminal Court, which has a warrant for his arrest. Also ahead, Beijing's foreign minister heads to Moscow. We'll ask how China can get involved in bringing about a ceasefire in Ukraine. We'll have an update on the US Defense Secretary's first tour of Asia, and we'll meet the team at the Kyiv Independent as they get ready to publish their first print magazine.
Ukraine isn't just the war and destruction and tragedy. It's so much more. It's amazing people, it's creators, it's designers, it's musicians, all of these amazing things that we want to show the world.
Plus the latest urbanism news, and we ask if Japan can outdo South Korea as it tries to take a leaf out of K-pop's books. That's all coming up on The Globalist, live from London. First, a quick look at what else is happening in today's news. China has begun joint military exercises around Taiwan to serve what it calls as a stern warning to Taipei. British, French and Ukrainian military leaders are to meet in the coming days to build on real momentum in efforts to boost Ukraine's security. And the leader of France's far right, Marine Le Pen, says she will appeal against a conviction for embezzlement, banning her from running in the French presidential elections. Stay tuned to Monocle Radio throughout the day for more on these stories. But first, when the Israeli Prime Minister sets foot on Hungarian soil tomorrow, he will not only be arriving in a country led by one of his closest allies, he will also be sending a clear message to the International Criminal Court, and that is, catch me if you can. Hungary is legally bound to cooperate fully with the ICC. It is a state party to the Rome Statute. But when the ICC issued a warrant for Mr Netanyahu's arrest on suspicion of committing war crimes in Gaza, the Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orbán immediately said he would not follow the court's instructions and issued an invitation to Mr Netanyahu. Well, to explore this further, I'm joined on the line from The Hague by Janet Anderson, President of the Associate of Journalists at the International Criminal Court in The Hague, and by Yossi Meckelberg, here in the studio, Associate Fellow with the Middle East and North Africa Programme at Chatham House. A very good morning to you both.
Good morning.
Morning.
Janet, this does come across very clearly as a major snub to the ICC.
Yes, clearly so. Hungary is a member state, but there are quite a few states who are not happy with the ICC going after the president of Russia, and some who are not happy with him going after the president with the Prime Minister of Israel. So the ICC is under a lot of pressure on this and is not necessarily has any sort of major tools with which to punish Hungary for doing this.
And just as describing that, Janet, suggests that the ICC can, in many people's eyes, and indeed not least in Mr Netanyahu's and Mr Orbán's eyes, be seen as a political body as much as this is a legal one. How much would that be correct?
Well, I think it is a political body in the sense that states sign up to it. It becomes, but then they sign up to a court, and a court is run by judges, and the judges make the decisions. So they will always argue that they are following the precepts of the Rome Statute. States know what they have signed up to. Hungary knew what it signed up to when it agreed to this. So yeah, I mean, the politics are there because it operates in a political system and because it is states who have signed up to it. But fundamentally, it is a court.
Yossi, just turning to what Benjamin Netanyahu stands to gain from a trip to Hungary. Obviously, it is the moment when he can demonstrate two things. Firstly, that he has allies in Europe, and secondly, he can travel.
He has very few allies in Europe, but for him, Hungary is very, very important. Because of the structure of the European Union, Hungary on foreign policy and as another issue has the veto right as any other country. So whenever it's get a bit sticky for Israel with the European Union, he can rely on his almost soulmate in Europe, Viktor Orbán, because they play the same, it's the same playbook about how you deal. You are elected democratically, and then you make sure that the next few years until the next election, democracy is very limited when it comes to freedom of speech, when it comes to the checks of balances, separation of powers, and the rest. So it's very important for him. The other thing, I think, considering, for instance, what happened in the last 24 hours in Israel, which is known now as the Qatar Gate, and another investigation, it gives them a respite. Also, it delayed another day in court, corruption court. And of course, by complete coincidence, every trip right now abroad involves also a very luxurious weekend with his wife somewhere.
I didn't know that. Janet, this is not just, Hungary isn't just the first country to not enforce the warrant. There seems to be quite a strong division, doesn't there, between those who have come out in support of Netanyahu and those who have come out in support of the court.
There were indications. Poland had said that they would welcome the Israeli Prime Minister. Obviously you have the United States, which has put sanctions on the ICC prosecutor. So Netanyahu has been welcome there, but the United States isn't a member of the court. Yeah, there are a lot of places that he can now travel. It will be challenged by the courts. There will be a challenge which will go through the court and will go to the other members of the court to try to slap Israel on the hand to say you shouldn't be doing this, but there will be no further sanction than that.
And staying with you, Janet, what does this mean for other cases or which the ICC is looking at with the intent to prosecute or to bring to trial? What kind of sort of chilling effect does it have on the ICC's ability to actually do its job?
Well, I think it's quite a beleaguered court generally at the moment. As I mentioned, the sanctions against the prosecutor from Washington right now. So this doesn't help. They've also got everything that's going on with Ukraine and Russia, and whether there will be any sort of protection of the move to try to get some kind of an accountability for the Russian aggression there. So I think it won't, though, necessarily affect any of the ongoing trials. One is about the Central African Republic, and that really isn't high up the political agenda. It's really these high-profile cases that show how weak, essentially, the ICC's hand is.
Yossi, returning to you, the relationship between Viktor Orbán and Benjamin Netanyahu is one, as you've just described, two like-minded souls who find themselves in a beleaguered position in the eyes of several people. But the fact is that it's not long since Viktor Orbán was singled out for anti-Semitic rhetoric and having a problem. Does he have a problem with anti-Semitism? What does this mean for the relationship between Netanyahu and Orbán?
If I may, just one thing with what Janet said, I think we see gradually the collapse of the world order. You sign to convention and you don't need to follow it. It's the NPT, it's the ICC, it's the ICJ. It's the collapse of the role of international law in so many ways. Which, if you want to take a piece of territory, it's fine. Israel takes part of Syria, and Turkey is doing the same, and Ukraine and Russia, and then Trump wants to violate the sovereignty of another places. But specifically, in a very strange way, Netanyahu doesn't have a problem with anti-Semites. There was just a conference in Israel, a conference against anti-Semitism, and delegation of far right, including anti-Semites, participated in this, and the president of Israel was present there. And so there is because on the one hand, Israel, of course, is the product, one of the of fighting anti-Semitism, of what happened in Europe through the 18th, 19th century, 20th century, of course. But at the same time, it meant allies right now because of the criticism for the progressive liberal against the occupation and Gaza and the rest. They found their allies with the worst, basically, friends that you can find of the far right in Europe, in the United States. So there is this kind of intrinsic contradiction between who are these friends and why the raison d'etat of Israel's existence, and it seems that it doesn't bother Netanyahu. We know the campaign in Hungary and the anti-Semitic campaign in Hungary under Orbán, but they are the best friends. What he gets out of it, he can go to Hungary. Israel football team is playing its home games in Hungary because it can't play because of the war in Israel. So you get all of that. But in the long term, whether it's the Christian Zionist, the evangelist in the United States, that at the end of the day want all Jews to convert to Christianity, or the anti-Semite in Europe, with friends like this, who needs enemies?
Janet, just finally coming back to you and picking up on what Yossi has just said. I mean, you described the ICC as beleaguered. Yossi went one step further and said that actually this is the beginning of the collapse of a world order where you have people signing up to a court and yet you don't believe that you had to adhere to its jurisdiction. Is there a sense in The Hague that that is what's happening at the moment?
I don't think it's only in The Hague. I think Yossi describes it well. We are all wondering whether there is really a long-term future for international criminal law when you can see humanitarian workers in Gaza being killed, and we don't know whether there will be any accountability for actions like that. If the rules that have applied since the Second World War on humanitarian law, institutions have been set up, states have signed up, and then they don't agree to apply the rules that they have signed up for. We all wonder where we are. So, yeah, I think that the ICC is only one element in this wider maelstrom that we're all living in. That isn't only Trump, but he is one of the symptoms of that, and others becoming bolder in their decisions not to follow the rules that we have all agreed.
Janet Anderson in The Hague and Yossi Meckelberg here in the studio. Thank you both for joining us on The Globalist. .13 here in London. Now, it appears that as well as the US, could China now be interested in helping to bring about a ceasefire in Ukraine? Beijing is sending its foreign minister to Moscow for talks with its Russian counterpart and has already said the principle of friends forever, never enemies serves as a solid basis for advancing strategic cooperation. Well, to explain what that means, I'm joined now by David Schlesinger, who's an independent advisor and commentator on media journalism and China. Sorry, I've just made an absolute hash of your name, David. Good to see you back in the studio. What do we mean by this press release that's been issued in the last few hours? China and Russia are friends forever, never enemies. Did we know that?
Well, we knew some of that, except for the times when they were at war and I had great tension. But yes, the general principle is there. Look, I think you have to look at the weird and wacky chessboard that we have now in the world. Just 2 months ago, you had the US and Europe on one side, and you had China and Russia on the other side about Ukraine. Now you have Europe standing alone. And oddly, in the Trumpian world, Russia, China, and the U.S. all have relatively similar positions on Ukraine at the moment. Very strange. That's one level. But the second level is that China has been this great ally of Russia throughout the last 3 years of the Ukraine war, when the rest of the world has tried to have sanctions and isolate Russia. Beijing has been there as a great and steady friend. But now the concern is that the great deal maker, Donald Trump, may try to use his friendship with Putin to isolate China further, because it is clear that China is in the sights of U.S. foreign policy. The Washington Post last week got a memo from the Pentagon, which basically said, we have to prepare for war with China, let Europe take care of Moscow. So China doesn't want anything to get in the way of their friendship with Moscow.
And in this context, is that why the Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi is in Moscow at the moment?
I think that's part of it. But they do have a very close relationship. China is Russia's biggest trade partner. China has been there throughout this crisis and has taken advantage of it. Xi Jinping and Putin have a wonderful relationship. They've met something like 40 times in the past 10 years. That's a lot. Xi is going again next month. Putin's going to go to Beijing later this year. Meanwhile, Trump would desperately love to have a meeting with Xi, but they haven't yet arranged it. So Wang Yi is there to shore things up. And if he can make some progress on Ukraine, that would be wonderful for China too. From the very beginning of this conflict, China has wanted to play a role. People have sort of poo-pooed its efforts. China and Brazil have put forward proposals for a stand-bound, but this has really been a great power, European, U.S. Issue, and China hasn't really had a look in.
So what role could Beijing play in all this, given the fact that, as you say, it's had a go in the past, both by itself and with Brazil, these general principles to end the conflict, which were rejected by both sides. What purpose does China's involvement in trying to end the war in Ukraine serve?
Well, perhaps I could link it to your last segment where you talked a lot about how international institutions are crumbling. China actually believes in international institutions. When China regained the seat in the UN and it became a permanent member of the UN Security Council after kicking out the nationalist government in Taiwan, which had held the China seat, that was the major foreign policy triumph for China. And China now has a seat at the table. It wants international institutions to do their thing because it has a voice there. So I think for China, a key role is to try to make sure that this is not just a Donald Trump says and the world jumps. This is a global, major powers working together in some kind of united agenda to bring about peace.
The timing of Wang Yi's arrival in Moscow has been described as not great, given the fact that in the last 48 hours, Donald Trump has quite openly described talked about his displeasure with Vladimir Putin. Does this change things at all, or does China just plow on by itself?
I think from China's point of view, it's very good timing because China can say to Wang Yi can say to Putin, he's going to meet Putin. He can say, look, don't trust Trump. Trump will turn on you. Trump wants you to jump to his tune. Let's together find a way of making progress and having a more fair and unified approach to the problem.
Tell us a little bit more about what China's relationship with Europe is now. I mean, we have obviously China being in Russia at the moment and Europe trying to shore itself up against Russia. But last week we had the French foreign minister asking China to lobby Russia on the Ukrainian situation. What is the relationship there now?
I think that Europe needs to come up with a new China plan. I think in the past couple of years, Europe has very much followed the U.S. lead that China needs to be contained, that we have to be wary of China. But now that Europe can no longer rely on the United States as an ally or a trade partner, China, I think, has a possibility there, has potential to jump into the breach. But China has to clean up its own act. Even as I say this, of course, there are allegations of bribery against Huawei, the Chinese telecommunications company in Europe. There have been, of course, human rights issues. There have been, of course, issues about how much data goes back to Beijing and what Beijing does with it. So China doesn't have an easy road, but I think there is potential as the U.S. goes into this Washington first, last, and only phase. China has a role to play and perhaps could take advantage.
David Schlesinger, thank you so much, as ever, for joining me in the studio. Still to come on today's programme.
The shocking sight of an official tower turned to dust and rubble has created a sense of anxiety and paranoia across the city, especially among civil servants working in tall towers.
Monocle's Asia editor James Chambers will tell us how the earthquake in Myanmar has impacted the lives 800 kilometres away in the Thai capital of Bangkok. This is The Globalist.
UBS is a global financial services firm with over 150 years of heritage. Built on the unique dedication of our people, we bring fresh thinking and perspective to our work. We know that it takes a marriage of intelligence and heart to create lasting value for our clients. It's about having the right ideas, of course, but also about having one of the most accomplished systems and an unrivaled network of global experts. That's why at UBS, we pride ourselves on thinking smarter to make a real difference. Tune in to The Bulletin with UBS every week for the latest insights and opinions from UBS all around the world.
Just nudging 7:22 here in London. Let's continue now with today's newspapers. Joining me in the studio is Theo Usherwood, political journalist and broadcaster. Very good morning to you, Theo. Good to have you.
Very good morning.
How's life in the Usherwood world?
It's well. We're good.
What are you up to? It's the good stuff.
I'm just lots of freelance work and all over, and it's delightful to be with you, Monocle today.
I'm flattered immensely. Right, let's have a look at the papers. So if you go pretty much to every single front page, there is a picture of a very beleaguered Marine Le Pen. I mean, in the last 12 hours, she's come out fighting, so she's going to appeal the conviction. But to all intents and purposes, yesterday's judgment convicting her of embezzlement has knocked her clean out of the presidential race in France.
Yes, and it's an extraordinary story. And I think what's going to be so fascinating is the way it goes from here. Now, of course, it looks very likely this ban is going to be upheld. She's going to be prevented from standing in that presidential election in 2027, an election that, to all intents and purposes, she was predicted to win. We've seen a surge of far-right support in Germany. We've seen Reform UK under Nigel Farage do very well here in the UK. She was the French version of that. The question now is, by taking this action, by banning her from this election, has the centrist establishment within France stored up more problems for later? And already her supporters are starting to talk about a travesty for democracy. The fact that French voters won't be given the option of voting for Marine Le Pen. Of course, National Rally are expected to field a candidate. It remains to be seen who that is in the presidential election. But whether this just only adds pressure within that pressure cooker that actually we see National Rally do very well in 5 years from 2027.
Indeed, and just looking at the way that the papers are covering it this morning, Le Parisien has immediately gone into the idea of, what is going to happen in the presidential election in 2027 in France, given the fact that Macron can't stand again. Mm-hmm. The Rassemblement National, Marine Le Pen's party, was doing incredibly well and gave Macron a real burned his toes. Now all the other leaders in France are trying to work out what their next move is, given the fact that a vacuum has now been created, and that could create absolute rage.
Yes, and that's the danger with this announcement, is that, as you say, there is this vacuum. Macron doesn't stand again, so there needs to be a successor for his party, and of course there needs to be somebody who comes in to succeed, whether it's Jordan Bardella or somebody else comes in to take over from Marine Le Pen. But let's just fantasy politics with this. They lose the far right lose that election that they felt was theirs to win and that they would have won. Then the danger is that we end up with this backlash that you might see civil unrest as a result of it in the medium term, but I think potentially much more, for those who represent central politics, whether just to the left or just to the right, centrist politics just to the left or just to the right, the much greater danger will come in subsequent elections, because you would think that Marine Le Pen would after her ban try to stand in 2032, and that it becomes you think to the way that Donald Trump talked about the 2020 election, we'll come on to what he's got to say in a minute, being rigged, that he used that to great effect in last November's presidential election of saying, now I'm finally getting my turn. I was prevented, I was held back, I wasn't allowed to take what was rightfully mine in 2020. Now I'm coming back. And he used that to great effect at the last election.
Theo, you've been a political journalist for a good long time. What happened to dignity?
Oh, that's long gone. That sort of fell under a duvet, sort of circa 2014.
Okay, that's all we need to know. Thank you very much indeed. In the meantime, we're now going to scrapping. Speaking of dignity, let's move on to Donald Trump. As you mentioned a moment ago, he said he's not joking about the possibility of serving a third term. And you hear these... I'm not sure how we approach this story, given the fact that when you think about it on paper, it would require phenomenal barriers to be overcome if Trump were to be able to even be eligible to run for a third term. There are checks and balances inside America's infrastructure which are designed to stop this from happening. And so you immediately say, it could never happen, it could never happen, it could never happen. And then you just have to think, actually, a reality TV estate agent mogul is now president, well, estate mogul is now president of the United States. So all bets are now off, aren't they?
Yes, and they seem to have found a loophole, which I think this is fascinating. As you say, the proper way of doing it would, of course, require a change of the Constitution, but that requires 2/3 approval from both the Senate and the House of Representatives, as well as approval from 3/4 of the country's state-level governments. That's not going to happen because the Republicans don't have the required majorities. But what they're now looking at doing is it says the Constitution says that no person should be held as president, and they should be elected, shall be elected to the office of president for more than once. That, they say, creates a loophole that they can, this is the Trump campaign, that says nothing about a succession. So you would end up in a situation where J.D. Vance stands as in 2028. He wins as president, and then he immediately resigns, and Donald Trump is his vice presidential running mate, and then takes over from J.D. Vance. And that they're looking now at possibly a legal challenge to this. But I just think that the narrative that Trump is building up, saying he's not joking about it, or lots of people are asking me to think about a third term, the idea that he's very shrewd and acute in the way that he's playing this out is that he wants America to want him, rather than saying, I'm just going to go for it, I'm going to go for this third term. He's trying to get America to come to his position. So the third term is the way to go.
I found it quite astonishing the speed at which he's come out with this. I mean, the paint's barely dry in the White House, and he's already saying he wants a third crack.
Yes, but it was something that came up during the presidential. It was something that came up during the third presidential election. He's very good, Donald Trump, at courting and bringing into the mainstream fringe views from all manner of people and thinkers, and then bringing them in the mainstream to justify what he is trying to achieve. And it's looking now that this is going to gain. This is going to gain increasing traction in the United States, and whether it actually then, he's not bothered, I think, about either securing any change to the Constitution, but whether he looks at actually now bringing forward a challenge, whether it be through the courts of the Constitution, to actually test it before, of course, 2028 and possibly J.D. Vance. And we know that J.D. Vance, given his vulnerability to Trump and the way he has served as vice president, that wouldn't be an issue for one moment, the fact that he would run and then stand aside.
Theo Usherwood, thank you so much for joining me in the studio. The time here in London is just nudging 7:30 a.m. You're listening to The Globalist with me, Emma Nelson. A look now at some of the other stories we're following today. China has begun joint military exercises around Taiwan to serve as what it calls a stern warning. Beijing has also called the Taiwanese president a parasite, as Taipei sent warships to respond to China's navy approaching the coast. British, French and Ukrainian military leaders are to meet in the coming days to build on real momentum in efforts to boost Ukraine's security. A spokesperson for the British Prime Minister said the meeting was to drive forward the next stage of detailed planning. The US says it's deported more Venezuelan alleged gang members to a prison in El Salvador, despite a legal challenge to the process. The US Secretary of State said among the 17 men were murderers and rapists. They were deported using law dating back to the 18th century, even though a federal judge has temporarily blocked the policy. Denmark and the US are to hold their first high-level talk since Donald Trump came to power and declared he wished to take Greenland. The Danish foreign minister will travel to Brussels to meet his foreign counterpart at a NATO gathering later this week. And the leader of France's far right, Marine Le Pen, says she has no intention of withdrawing from the political scene and will continue fighting. She was convicted yesterday of embezzlement and was banned from running in the French presidential election in 2027. Madame Le Pen has condemned the judgment as political and has vowed to appeal the verdict. This is The Globalist. Stay tuned. Now it's time for another story that we've been paying attention to. Last week, a 7.7 magnitude earthquake struck Myanmar, with neighbouring Thailand also affected. Well, Monocle's Asia editor James Chambers reflects now on the response in Bangkok and how leadership can make a difference.
Days after the devastating earthquake in Myanmar, where the death toll continues to rise, neighbouring Thailand is entering the review and recriminations phase. The tremors that shook the capital Bangkok on Friday caused an unfinished 30-storey government building to collapse in a deadly heap. As rescue teams continue to look for the trapped construction workers, attention is turning to the design of the tower and the type of steel being used. The Chinese contractors are being lined up to take the blame, but the government will ultimately have to own this one. The building was, after all, meant to house the National Audit Office, the department in charge of overseeing government spending. The shocking sight of an official tower turned to dust and rubble has created a sense of anxiety and paranoia across the city, especially among civil servants working in tall towers. Noises and bangs on Monday morning prompted spontaneous evacuations of entire buildings, as rumours spread on messaging apps claiming to predict the time of another aftershock. False information has been able to flourish since Friday because of a lack of official information. State-owned airwaves were slow to react, and the government's new SMS-based disaster alert system took hours to send out a warning message. I received mine a full 7 hours after the earthquake. 2 hours later, my wife received hers. And among this sense of unease and uncertainty, Bangkok's governor, Chadchat Sitiput, has been the one official to emerge as a reassuring voice of calm, reason, and reliable information. The popular and highly energetic first-term governor, who is expected to announce a run for a second term very soon, has hardly put a foot wrong. He took charge of the situation while the Prime Minister was out of town, and he was quick to reassure citizens that Bangkok was okay. Since Friday, he has been taking steps to address collective anxiety about building safety and making sure the city's regular open-air concerts went ahead to entertain the larger-than-usual crowds spending time outdoors. Bangkok's experience is a wake-up call for any major city still without a democratically elected leader in City Hall. Governors and mayors may spend a lot of their time dealing with rubbish collection, parks, and other mundane everyday issues. But when a disaster strikes, they know how to manage their city better than most. For Monocle in Bangkok, I'm James Chambers.
Thank you, James. For more from Monocle's editors and correspondents, sign up for our free daily newsletter, The Monocle Minute, at monocle.com/minute. $15:35 in Tokyo, 7:35 here in London. Now, America's Defense Secretary has stressed the importance of the US-Japan alliance to act as a counter to China. Pete Hegseth was speaking during a trip to Japan. It's part of his first visit to Asia in his new role. And to tell us more, I'm joined now by Jesse Johnson, geopolitics and defence correspondent at the Japan Times. He joins me on the line now from Tokyo. A very good afternoon to you, Jesse.
Hi there, thanks for having me.
So there was this fear, wasn't there, that this new world that the United States is introducing to us all would leave the likes of Japan very vulnerable? Sure,
but Japan has had a lot of experience with Trump in the first term, and they managed to weather that quite well. What Japanese defense officials are telling me from this meeting is that there were basically four key things that they sought, and they managed to secure all of them. And among these are the making progress and upgrading the U.S. military's command in Japan, because there had been reports that this might be canceled or scaled back under Trump, and also boosting the military's presence in Japan's southwestern islands, which is an area near Taiwan, and then also defense industrial cooperation, and another one that Trump had kind of implicitly threatened, which is multilateral cooperation. Japan's really keen on the U.S. working with Australia, South Korea, Philippines, and other like-minded partners.
As a result, Japan must be feeling pretty relieved this morning or this afternoon.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, most of the officials at the Defense Ministry that I've spoken with here in Tokyo have felt that this was just more of a get-to-know-you kind of meeting, but they do feel that they made some progress. I mean, Trump has repeatedly talked about how the U.S.-Japan alliance is unfair, and Japan might need to pay more to host American troops or to pay more for its defense budgets, even though it's significantly ramped up spending.
Explain to us a little bit more about the U.S. view of Japan in terms of defense and the role that Japan plays in that part of the world.
Right. Well, it really comes down to one word: China. It's all about China for both Japan and the U.S. And outcompeting them. Because as Secretary Hegseth said during his meeting here, Japan is on the, as he said, quote, front lines, unquote, of this competition, right? So in a sense, Japan is kind of an outlier when it's compared with other allies that Trump has been targeting, other allies of the U.S., like other alliances like NATO, or, asking them to pay more, or just really in general kind of Trump has a negative view towards alliances, and he takes a very transactional view towards these things. So Japan's managed to weather that, and I think they're probably going to continue to do so.
What is it about the way that the Japanese do things that seems to chime so well with the Trump administration?
That's a good question. I mean, it's really kind of something that's elusive, but in a sense, in the first term, they had a so-called Trump whisperer in late Prime Minister Shinzo Abe. Now there's not really a guy who can do that in a leadership position, but I think just the importance of location, geography, Japan's, right on the front lines, as I mentioned earlier, with China, that it's just, the U.S. can't really afford to denigrate their alliance anymore, like other alliances.
Jesse Johnson joining us on the line from Tokyo. Thank you so much for joining us on Monocle Radio. Now let's hear more about the Ukrainian independent media project, the Kyiv Independent. It was launched 3 months before Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, and it's publishing its first print magazine called The Power Within. The magazine will offer a tangible snapshot of Ukraine 3 years into the war. On Monocle Radio's senior correspondent Fernando Augusto Pacheco caught up with Lilian Bavings, who's the business editor of the Kyiv Independent, to tell us more about their first issue and how the idea to do a print magazine came about.
There was this idea that it would be so nice to do something in print, you know? It was always just kind of an idea, maybe sort of like a dream. And then we brought on our photo editor, Irinka, and she's fabulous. She's wonderful. And she really brought this idea to life. She was, we had a person finally who could champion the project. And that's sort of how it was born. And of course, wanting to create something tangible for our audience to buy, to have at home, to have a piece of the Kyiv Independent on their coffee table or on their bookshelf. That was a really big part of it, I think, as well.
Well, and, I know the magazine is in the pre-sale phase at the moment, but it's been already quite successful. So perhaps you're also tapping into a market of readers who really wanted something like this. Tell us about the content of the magazine, how it would differ from what you can see online. Is it kind of a best of or all new content? Tell us a bit more about that.
Yeah, so we decided we would do all new content for the print edition. So it's very exclusive in a way. It's all exclusive articles that will be there for the first time. Some of them we have published on our website already as sort of a teaser or because they were timely. But most of these were articles that were commissioned specifically for the print edition. And when we were talking about it and what types of articles would be in there, these were, of course, big discussions, lengthy 2-3 hour long discussions on what do we want to tell people with this print edition, right? And there was this dynamic constantly at play over, well, we want to show the world what else Ukraine is besides war, right? Because Ukraine isn't just the war and destruction and tragedy. It's so much more. It's amazing people, it's creators, it's designers, it's musicians, all of these amazing things that we want to show the world. And so we tried to kind of focus on that. But then we thought, well, but wait a second, like the most important thing right now is the war. We can't avoid that. We can't try to show some other side without addressing the war. So we tried to find stories really that showed both sides, right? That show you this is the reality people are living. They're living in war, but they have so much more about them that it's impressive. They've created amazing technological advancements with few resources on the battlefield. Or, the resilience of flower producers who are still farming roses during the war and getting them to flower shops in Kyiv. And so it's about the war, right? But it's about other sides of people and their existence and their reality and their ability to carry on and even thrive in this environment, as weird as that sounds, to show people that Ukrainian spirit, so to speak. So it actually took us a long time to come up with the concept and the story ideas and commission the stories. And there were multiple times throughout it where we were seeing the stories come in and thinking, this isn't right. This isn't like what we wanted. And this is too much. I even, personally, there was a moment where I was like, every story is about war. Like, this is what we said we weren't going to do. And then I realized like, well, but listen, that is Ukraine right now. So it's a very special look at Ukraine right now. It's long form, very visually heavy stories with beautiful photographs. I mean, it's also an opportunity for us to showcase Ukrainian photographers, but they're also just stories that show the complexities of life of people during war. And I think that's what's really special about this product, particularly.
And if you think about it, it would be very much a historic product, right? A portrait of Ukraine at war at this moment. I mean, hopefully not in the coming years, but I think it would be quite interesting to see as well in a few years' time, the first edition of the magazine, for example.
Yeah, we actually had this conversation where exactly we wanted to show a snapshot of what Ukraine is right now during the war, right? But we're thinking, okay, it's coming out now, and there's all these conversations about a ceasefire and maybe the end to the war, and maybe an end to the war that isn't so favorable to Ukraine. And is it okay for us to put out a beautiful magazine showing the resilient spirit of Ukrainians and a snapshot of Ukraine during the war when everything might suddenly change or turn out poorly for Ukraine? And we had a couple conversations about that, and we decided, no, whatever happens in the coming months, this is still, all of the things that are in this edition are still true. These people still did these things. They still have these stories to tell. This is still their reality. And so it's okay to put it out, even if it comes out at a time that's not really coinciding with how things are going. But as you can see, every step we had these sort of, internal struggles. Are we doing the right thing? Are we doing it in the right way? And I think it was also for us really important not only to showcase Ukraine through the stories, but through the actual physical product itself. So, one thing I was really passionate about in the beginning was how oftentimes there's a stereotype that things that come out of Eastern Europe are cheap or, these are poor countries, so they're kind of whatever. There's these negative ideas about the things that are created in this part of the world, especially in relation to Western European products or designs or creations. And I'm, really passionate about, I'm the business editor, and I'm really passionate about there are amazing businesses and creators and designers and content creators, whatever it is, from Ukraine that do just as impressive work as their Western European counterparts. They're just less noticed.
And that was Liliane Bivings from the Kyiv Independent in conversation with Monocle's Fernando Augusto Pacheco. You can pre-order The Power Within by heading over to KyievIndependent.com. This is The Globalist on Monocle Radio.
UBS has over 900 investment analysts from over 100 different countries.
Over 900 of the sharpest minds and freshest thinkers in the world of finance today.
To find out how we could help you,
contact us at ubs.com.
Time now on The Globalist to hear some urbanism news. Monocle's contributing editor Sheena Rossiter joins us now on the line from Edmonton. Good evening, Sheena.
Good evening. Good morning to you.
Good to have you back on the programme. Tell us, let's head straight to Canada some university researchers are trying to use robotics for urban planning.
Yeah, so the Robocraft robotic arm is part of the innovation and research initiative that's undertaken by the University of Calgary School of Architecture, Planning and Landscape under the Urban Alliance Partnership. So this arm that weighs 450 kilograms, it arrived in Calgary, and they're using the tools to test drive, if you will, new methods to build more accessible and efficient urban landscapes in cities, especially they're test driving it on Calgary to start out. So through custom-built designs and new fabrication software, the researchers behind the project, what they're looking at doing is simulating and doing tests on these complex construction techniques through experimentation and through the functions of like inclusivity. This project is being led by Namad Vasquez, and it's going to be a 3-year initiative with University of Calgary researchers and city experts who are using 3D robotics to explore 3D printing in urban environments. So this is a pretty innovative project, and the goal is that this will be in the future that anyone can be able to use these digital tools to design 3D printed objects for public spaces, ranging from wheelchair ramps to paving stones. And this is just really the idea to help kind of meet community needs in our urban planning.
And it's an interesting idea, isn't it, to use something which is obviously robotic to help with the most human of needs, which is how to design a city. So how does it help?
Yeah, it's, urban planners, when they're building cities, they're building it for people and the spaces for people to effectively live their lives in. So the way that researchers are looking at this approach is that it not only enhances community participation, but it also opens doors to workforce development, and it's helping equip individuals with expertise in robotic fabrication and digital manufacturing. So even though it's still very much in the experimental phase right now, what they're looking at doing is they're hoping to embed this technology into the design and fabrication process by using this Robocraft arm. And they're hoping to create cities and how they can evolve and change their needs and responses to what's needed in cities. So this is kind of a two-way benefit, really, because not only does it help the urban planners, but it also helps researchers and students. It creates this real-world laboratory for innovation, and it also helps test things out before you spend quite a bit of money in implementing something in the city when you can kind of test it out in the lab first. And this is catching on international attention, by the way, I should say. This will be showcased in May in Venice at the Biennale, which is the world's largest architectural design exhibition.
Good to hear it. Let's head to China, where they are pushing ahead with brand new urban thinking. And there's a sports complex which has just opened, which is sort of setting the benchmark for lots of other places.
Yeah, normally this wouldn't make headlines globally. It's like, okay, well, this is just a rather large sports complex, but where it was built is really what is making news. So it's the Xiongjiang Sports Center complex that is opened after 1,000 days of construction. And the important point to note here is that it is built in the northern part of Xiongjiang area, which is effectively a startup city. So this sports complex is just massive. It's comprised of a stadium, gymnasium, a swimming hall, outdoor fields, fitness trails, you name it. It offers everything from 30,000 seats to a gymnasium with 10,000 seats and a swimming hall with over 2,000 seats. So it is based primarily on Chinese aesthetic, and the architecture is kind of blended around this square and circular geometry that kind of goes back to Chinese minimalism, really. But notably, it is a near zero energy consumption venue, and it's made with renewable energy that exceeds about 40%. So the aim of the center is to integrate sports and culture and exploring the cultural scenario of what the city is basically looking to build out to be. And they're looking to host the under-21 CUBA basketball games there in the near future.
Which is great and brilliant if you actually have people to go to it.
Yes, this has been one of the big critiques of this $93 billion smart city that is part of President Xi Jinping's utopian legacy, or it's supposed to be. So actually, they started building it 8 years to the day. So on April 1st, 2017, that's when they started building this. But 8 years on from the development, one of the world's most expensive infrastructure projects, it remains largely empty. No one really lives there. It's located about 60 miles outside of Beijing, and the whole purpose of it was to ease pressure from the overcrowding and the congestion that you see in the Chinese capital of more than 20 million people. But the streets in this metropolis are still largely emptied, and effectively what they had to do was they had to flatten several villages that wasn't much more than swamp water in certain parts in order to build the city. And the main attraction of the city so far is the train station, which is larger than 88 football fields, and you can have thousands of passengers passing through it a day. But it's still pretty much largely empty. And, they're still very much building the city. It's not expected to be done for another 10 years. And there are hopes that this will be China's socialist metropolis. We've already seen success with this with Shenzhen, which was built in the 1980s. And now 17 million people live there, but they're still not quite there yet. So although they are still very much building up this city, it's not quite the mega futuristic city that they are hoping it to be.
Sheena Rossiter on the line from Edmonton. Thank you as ever for joining us on Monocle Radio. You were the Globalist. 1553 in Seoul, and Seoul, it seems, has got it made when it comes to pop music. The K-pop genre has become one of South Korea's biggest and most successful international exports. So now Japan wants a bit of the fun too. The Japanese government has compiled a report on how the country can follow Seoul's success. So can Japan out K-pop Korea? Well, Bernie Cho is the president of the Seoul-based K-pop agency DFSB Collective and a regular voice here. Welcome back, Bernie. Good afternoon.
No, it's good to be back.
So just explain to us, very briefly, could you explain what is it that K-pop gets it so right? I mean, it is now globally recognised and loved.
Well, I think as much as we talk about the music, if anything, now more than ever, it's the music business model that more and more people, particularly in the West and obviously in Japan, are studying because they want to reverse engineer the secret sauce. What is making K-pop pop, not just locally, regionally, but more importantly, globally? And I read that Japanese government report. It was quite thick. It was quite intensive and very extensive. And in many ways, there are a lot of lessons learned about the Korean and the K-pop experience that more and more countries, particularly governments, are not only wanting but needing to study. Because as much as we talk about K-pop in terms of sort of its creative impact, the commercial impact is what's got everybody's attention. Currently, right now, when we look at Korea, yes, K-pop is obviously the most recognized thing coming out of Korea. But the impact, not just K-pop, but K-pop culture has had in terms of exports. It's the second largest consumer goods exports out of South Korea, just behind automobiles. And more importantly is the impact that K-pop has in terms of sort of its amplification of other aspects of Korean pop culture, whether it be fashion, whether it be beauty, and whether it be TV and film. And so obviously, Japan is learning and studying and implementing a lot of lessons learned from Korea, and we're starting to see some very promising early results coming from Japan, from J-pop, taking a few pages out of the K-pop playbook.
So tell us, I mean, K-pop is universally acknowledged as not just being successful, but a lot of it's pretty decent music. Is J-pop as good?
Oh, the interesting thing is a lot of the fundamentals and the elements of J-pop and K-pop are very similar. One of the things that's very interesting at the moment is a lot of the biggest, not just K-pop, but also J-pop hits are actually written and produced by non-Korean, non-Japanese, non-Asian songwriters and producers. The second element that we're starting to see is training. The training system, Korea actually learned it from Japan and improved it, and now the Japanese are learning the improved version of essentially their training system. And then the other thing that's absolutely fascinating is the marketing and promotions of J-pop and K-pop. We're starting to see what we would call globalization in the sense that the music is tailored for not just local or global audiences, but local and global audiences at the same time. It's become more and more the rule and less the exception, where members of J-pop and K-pop bands are not only multilingual, often multicultural, and if anything, maybe even multinational. And we're starting to see more collaborations. I think right now what we're starting to see in terms of the J-pop experience vis-a-vis through the K-pop learnings is really two tracks that are enabling and, more importantly, empowering J-pop acts to export bigger and, more importantly, better. Is number one, a lot of these Japanese acts, particularly a band called XG, they're actually sending their artists, their musicians, for training in Korea to learn the K-pop way, learn the Korean language. And then what we're starting to see is a lot of Japanese acts, before they make the leap overseas, the beta test market for them is Korea. If they can find some traction and attraction from Korea, they feel confident enough to go beyond Korea and beyond Asia. And then the second thing that's interesting is, as much as we talk about Korean TV dramas, and it's done wonders in terms of spreading Korean music globally, vis-a-vis through Netflix, we're also seeing Netflix kind of sort of have a hand in the rise and further rise, really, of J-pop vis-a-vis through anime. The popularity of anime through Netflix going global, a lot of these J-pop songs and these J-pop artists like Yasobi right now is very much riding on the wave of anime popularity. And so it's interesting to see, and more importantly, to study how J-pop and K-pop are using the similarities to find similar results.
Benny Cho in Seoul, thank you so much for joining me on The Globalist. And that's all the time we have for today's programme. The warmest of thanks to all my guests and to the producers Hassan Anderson and Carlotta Ribello. Our research was Francesca Jilks. Our studio manager was Lily Austin, with editing assistance from Steph Chungu. After the headlines, more music on the way. The briefing's live at midday here in London. The Globalist is back at the same time tomorrow. But for now, from me, Emma Nelson, goodbye. Thank you very much for listening.